One of the most basic measures of government integrity is whether that government is open, accessible, welcoming, and accountable to the people it serves. That's us, the taxpayers. Well, the Better Government Association is disappointed to report that on that basic measure of government integrity, government that's open, accessible, welcoming, and accountable, the 50 states in this great country fail the basic integrity test miserably. They get an F. They flunk Integrity 101. I'm Andy Shaw, President and CEO of the Better Government Association. I want to thank you for joining us as we roll out this iteration of the BGA-Alper Services Integrity Index. I'll say a few words to set the context. I'll be followed then by Emily Miller, who's our Coordinator of Government Relations and Policy. After that, one of our board members, Patrick Collins, a former U.S. attorney who prosecuted the George Ryan case. And finally, David Macklin, President of Alper Services, which thankfully helped us to underwrite the cost of the index. Corruption with a big C is the illegal stuff that puts public officials in jail. To do that, it generally requires the work of federal and state prosecutors. Corruption with a small c is the more pervasive and insidious type. Waste, fraud, misconduct, inefficiency, nepotism, cronyism, patronage, padded payrolls, padded contracts, pay-to-play, inside deals. The best way to combat this form of corruption is with an engaged citizenry that can keep an eye on government. That means the government has to be open and accessible and welcoming and accountable. People have to be able to attend meetings, review documents, speak up when something doesn't look right, and take a measure of their public officials to see if those public officials are working for them, the taxpayers, or themselves, those individuals. As I said, it is disappointing to report that on this basic test of integrity, a government that's open, accessible, welcoming, and accountable, our 50 states in this great country fail the test miserably. They flunk Integrity 101. They get an F. We spent the last year as a staff and with a series of consultants going over basic integrity laws in all 50 states. We picked 4 specifically: Freedom of Information Act, Open Meetings Act, Whistleblower Protection, and Conflicts of Interest. We looked at the strength of the laws in the 50 states. We measured them, we weighted them, and we came out with a rating. It's really disappointing to say that on a scale of 1 to 100, the average integrity score of the 50 states is 55%. That is a failing grade on any exam, any place. It's an F. They have flunked the integrity test. It's interesting to note that the top scoring states, including Illinois, didn't even reach 70%. So they get at best a C- or a D+. Counterintuitively, the top 10 include 4 states typically thought of as the most corrupt: Illinois, Rhode Island, Louisiana, and New Jersey. They score in the top 6 on the integrity test. That tells us one basic thing, although it's impossible to parse the result exactly. In the states that had the brightest lights and the most heat on their sordid past, their corruption, have apparently taken the most small steps to make their government more accountable and transparent and open. They've taken the basic steps to be, those states have met the basic test of integrity a little better than their counterparts. That doesn't mean that public officials are following the law or adhering to it. In many cases, they aren't. But on paper, at least, those states have taken a few small steps. It's obvious that all 50 states have to go back to the drawing board and revisit this basic concept of integrity. The reason we did this index, quite simply, is to start a conversation about the obligation of government to meet this basic need of their citizens. Every American citizen has a right to a government that is open, accessible, welcoming, and accountable, where you can attend meetings without the door being shut in your face, where you can review documents without jumping through 1,000 hoops over 1,000 days, where you can point out alleged misconduct without fear of retribution, and where you can assess the public officials in your jurisdiction to figure out who they're working for, you or themselves. So, if nothing more comes of this, then a re-examination in all 50 states of this basic premise of integrity, I think we will have accomplished our objective. Down the road, it's quite possible that we will elevate the next integrity index to a different level, to a set of laws with teeth and consequences and sanctions that are aimed directly at regulating, controlling, and limiting the bad behavior of public officials. I suspect that many of the states in the top 10 on this integrity index will do much more poorly on that one. But today we're talking about basic integrity. We are a nonprofit watchdog group. We care about the public and their access. And so in this introductory way to demand an open government, we think this is very instructive because this is where the rubber meets the road. This is about a government that meets the basic needs of its people. Sad to say, the 50 states in our country have failed the integrity test. And with that, I'll turn it over to Emily Miller, who can parse some of the findings and give you a little insight into the methodology.
Good morning. My name is Emily Miller, and I am the Policy and Government Affairs Coordinator for the Better Government Association. I'm going to mention some trends that emerged from the BGA-Alper Services Integrity Index. Findings that signal systemic failures in the way that state governments are performing their fundamental duty to both protect and advance the people's right to know how their government functions. When examining how the states attempt to advance the public's right to know, we examined 4 areas of state law, as Andy mentioned: the Freedom of Information Act, the Open Meetings Act, conflict of interest laws, and whistleblower protections. A few trends emerged from the index. First, failing expectations. As mentioned, the index measured each state on a scale of 100%. And those 100 points were given out based on best practices. No state comes close to hitting that mark, and the overall average for all 50 states is an abysmal 55%. Corruption versus integrity laws. We found little evidence that states approach reform in a comprehensive or proactive manner. Rather, they tend to respond to crisis or scandal and try to fix the problems after they've already occurred. It's important to remember that this index is not a corruption index. This index measures the integrity laws based on the black letter law and case law that exists. And it is not a test of the way that these laws are implemented, as Andy mentioned. It will take more in Illinois to eliminate corruption than rewrites of the Freedom of Information Act, for example. But providing people with simple, accessible methods of collecting information about their government is an important first step. The technology disconnect. In this high-tech era, the states are struggling with the availability of electronic formats and the use of the internet to pass, The states are struggling with the availability of electronic formats and use of the internet to obtain and disperse public information. States are just beginning to pass laws and to address the proper use of technology, but most are woefully behind. Only 25 states even make it possible to obtain documents through accessible electronic formats. The BGA-Alper Index found that the Open Meetings Act is the weakest of the 4 basic integrity laws. In 34 states, the public is not even properly informed of meetings taking place or being scheduled. Finally, conflict of interest laws and whistleblower laws are lacking across the board. Many states fail to provide ready access to elected officials' basic financial information. And whistleblowers have scant protection against government employers who seek to take retribution against them for blowing the whistle. Those are just a few of the overall findings. There are many more findings in the BGA-Alper Services Integrity Index, and we'd be happy to answer any specific questions about any of those. The bottom line is that statutes designed to protect the public's inherent right to free, open, and easily accessible information are failing nationwide. States need to be more committed to being transparent and accountable to the people they serve.
I think something Patrick's next. Okay.
Do you wanna-
No, it's Patrick. We introduced him.
Okay.
You can say who he is. He's known nationwide.
Good morning, everyone. I had a deja vu moment up here. For 12 years, I stood behind the likes of Burns and Lasar and Fitzgerald, and then I got to now stand behind guy Andy Shaw. But it's all good. And from my perspective on this, again, I was in AUSA for 12 years in the office and did a lot of public corruption work. And I certainly came to the realization, I think, at the end of my tenure, and also during serving as Governor Quinn's Illinois Reform Commission chair, that you can't indict your way out of corruption. And I really want to applaud today the BGA. I'm a proud board member, so I'm biased. But I think the BGA, if you talk, Andy talks about the big C and little c of corruption, there's a lot of little c corruption out there, and I don't think there's any player in town, and I would dare say any player in the nation, that does as good a job as the BGA does in calling out the little c corruption wherever it exists. And the fact of the matter is, the U.S. Attorney's Office, I think, is very good at dealing with a segment of the big C corruption, but they're just simply not able, nor is the State's Attorney's Office, to deal with the little c corruption. And today's announcement of the Integrity Index, I think, is just yet another step for the BGA to be out at the forefront of this little c corruption game. You know, in the private sector, everybody talks about metrics and measurements, and how do you measure this, and what are best practices. And the way I look at the Integrity Index today is just the first step of announcing what best practices are across the United States. And I take no comfort, nor should anyone who's a resident of Illinois, that Illinois scores 70%. In 2009, I was around with the Illinois Reform Commission in an ill-fated attempt to, in the post-Blagojevich scandal era, to really bring Illinois to what, you know, we might be proud to have our kids come home with an 80 or 90% grade. But there are so many issues that Illinois punted on that it had a chance in 2009 to impact. But here we are in 2013, and what I really applaud the BGA and Andy Shaw in particular is just the steady, unrelenting drumbeat to show Illinois citizens that the way out of this culture of corruption, for which we have virtually weekly examples, the only way out of that culture of corruption is an engaged citizenry who ultimately pushes back. I frankly have been somewhat disappointed at how collectively we push back as a citizenry, but it's measurements like the Alper Index that give us a step in this direction. I would love to see, as Andy sort of foreshadowed, the next stage of this Alper Index to look at more significant measurements in law enforcement context. For example, consensual recordings. Anyone who's in law enforcement or who sat through the Blagojevich trial realizes what the ability to record conversations of public officials can do to bringing out corruption. Sad to say, Illinois was one of 2 states that didn't have any version of the consensual recording for public officials. That hasn't changed today. So I applaud the BGA for its work today. It's great work in bringing out this index, but there's much work to be done, and I can assure you the BGA is not resting, believing that today is a conclusion, but rather a next step in the ongoing battle of corruption. Thank you.
David Macklin, President of Alper Services.
Andy, thank you, and Emily, Patrick, thank you both. I want to explain why Alper Services and why I am here today, and perhaps now knowing what the scores are, what the next steps could be. Howard Alper, the founder and chairman of Alper Services, was introduced to the BGA years ago, about 40 years ago, and its illuminating message was so compelling that it immediately shone through how he became active in his trademark manner, both through his checkbook and, more important, through his deeds, how he serves as a life trustee. I am continuing our dedication to helping the BGA meet its goals and objectives. We are here today. One of our colleagues serves on its Young Leadership Board, and our partnership with the BGA will be perpetual. It's important to us. Andy's leadership the past 3 years has dramatically and, important to note, efficiently magnified the BGA's wattage. As has been, is, and will be the case, we proudly underwrite the BGA-Alper Services Integrity Index, a unique and invaluable endeavor to enhance the BGA's luminosity. We sincerely thank each and every member of the BGA policy team for their thoughtful and hard work the past year. How do we go forward? We seek to advance the BGA's mission, which is to shine light on government and hold public officials accountable. Our absolute conviction is that more transparent and efficient government at all levels will allow businesses to pay less in hidden taxes, to grow themselves, to thus hire more employees, and therefore help create, step by step, a healthier and brighter economy. It's the business sector, we believe, that can help drive public officials toward reform steps so that in the next iteration, perhaps the scores will be better. But again, this is just a first step. Thank you all.
Let me just end with one thought. Corruption with a small c deprives us of basic services, it robs us of hard-earned tax dollars, and it undermines our confidence in democracy. That's the insidious aspect of small c corruption. That's the intolerable and unacceptable aspect. When Patrick says that big C corruption puts a few people in jail, we know who they are. Those are high visibility cases. But every day in every jurisdiction in Illinois, we are being deprived of services, robbed of tax dollars, and disenfranchised as citizens when government is run for the insiders and not the public. And until these laws are strengthened, until we can attend every meeting that's held, review every document that's part of the public record, raise every question that comes to mind, and measure every public official on the simple question of who do you work for, we're going to be in terrible shape. The government's going to continue to be wasteful and inefficient and corrupt, small or large c. And this democracy is going to fail one of its most important tests. This great country, founded on principles that we love and adhere to and celebrated a couple weeks ago, will never begin to recognize its potential unless government leads the way. We have a failure of institutions of all sorts in this country now. I don't have to tell you what they are. The one that impacts us most directly, most often, and most insidiously is the failure of government to meet our basic needs, and it starts with transparency and openness and accountability. So thank you all very much.